This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, welcome back to Room 237, back with another review. As I continue my run through of films based on real life serial killers, and I'm going to do something a little different with this one. In my last video, I did a film that was based on one of the first known American serial killers. Not the first, but one of the first, 1920s Albert Fish. But I haven't done one from overseas yet, and this is, I believe, the first major serial killer from Russia, or and arguably one of the most notorious. It is another made-for-TV film, which I gotta hand it to those made-for-TV movies. Every one I've done so far has not only been really, really good, but the best representation of that story. And this was no exception. Granted, it wasn't cable TV, it was made for HBO, so it can be a little bit more graphic. Not that it does, but it could have. But still, another very solid made for TV killer film. It is from 1995, and that is Citizen X. Now it doesn't quite tell the story of the killer of Andre Chikatilo. Sorry, I'm stuttering so much. Andre Chikatilo. It's more so just about the botched investigation that was just riddled with bureaucracy and incompetence that essentially failed the people of Rostov and let Chikatilo get away for so long and commit so many murders. And that's fine, because that alone is a very good story. How you have this sort of this one detective that's kind of like a Jim Gordon. You know, he's depicted as kind of like a Boy Scout detective that will stop at nothing and kind of becomes obsessed with catching this killer. But in Soviet Russia, where they believe that, hey, the serial killers don't exist here. You've got gangs, you've got cults, you've got whatever else it could be, and the film does dive into that. Now, if you want a movie about a Chikatilo, there really isn't one. I mean, I do have the film of Ivalenko, which this one is more about the killer himself, but also about the investigation. Although this one, his name is Andrei Ivalenko. It's loosely based on Chikatilo, but it's close enough to where you could probably call it a Chikatilo film. It does take a lot of liberties, though, and this is with Malcolm McDowell playing him. This one is very accurate. Probably the most accurate that you're going to get as far as a Chikatilo goes. There is another film called Child 44, which his name isn't even Andre in that one. I think that's more of a dramatized, a fictionalized account of the investigation. I think it's centered around one specific victim. I have not seen it yet, but I've heard a lot of people say that it was better in this. And from what I've seen, between the two, this is the most accurate. And I would say this is a better film than of Ivalenko. Very, very solid. Now, I have New York Daily News says, give Silence of the Lambs a run for its money. I don't know if it's as good as Silence of the Lambs. It is a good detective going after a serial killer story. But I've seen some reviews where it says it's the best detective catching a serial killer movie since Silence of the Lambs. I don't really find them comparable, because this is based on a real life serial killer, whereas Buffalo Bill is, yes, it's a composite of 5 real serial killers, but a completely fictional killer. So I don't see how they're really in the same ballpark. But I was impressed by this. It does have enough of Chikatilo and his crimes in it to really get the idea of what kind of killer he was, whether it be through short scenes or voiceover, you really get just the kind of monster he was and what he did to these kids. Children is what he mainly targeted. So I'm going to give a warning ahead of time. Things involving of Andre Chikatilo can get pretty graphic, so a trigger warning from here on out. Not that the film shows anything, it mostly alludes to or implies, but when you get voiceover or exposition, it does get into graphic detail of just what he did to his victims, and it can get pretty graphic. As far as other stuff I have on him, of course, numerous documentaries, the roughly 24 encyclopedic books that I have on serial killers. I pulled this one because he's actually on the cover. I don't have any books specifically on him, although there are some. In fact, this film is based on the book The Killer Department by Robert Cullen, which is about the botched investigation, which I would like to read. But more specifically, I do have Cannibal Killers, and then, which deservedly so, the 10 worst serial killers, which that's him again right on the cover. And just not just his body count, which is staggeringly high, but just what he did to these kids and women. It was, there's a reason why some of the locals were actually accepting the idea that there might be a werewolf out there. And people were serious about that because he mutilated them, and often very sexually. So before I get too far, just about the film, it was directed by Chris Geromo, if I pronounce that correctly, which I believe he wrote, was it A Mississippi Burning? He wrote, and Miles from Home, which he also wrote the screenplay for this. And it has a really good cast. It has Stephen Rea, I think is how you pronounce it, which I really like him as a character actor. I liked him in V for Vendetta, which is kind of a similar character. You got Donald Sutherland as the head of the Soviets, I guess you would say. I always forget his real name. Mikhail Fedizov. I only really know them by their last names. Fedizov. And Stephen Rea plays Viktor Burakov. Both do a great job. You also have Max von Sydow as Dr. Buchanovsky, the psychiatrist brought in to profile Chikatilo, which was the first time that ever happened in Russia. And then you have Jeffrey DeMunn as Chikatilo himself. And I read somewhere that I think he was nominated for an Emmy for this, but he lost to either Sydow or Donald Sutherland. I don't know if it was for this or for something else. But he has a very subdued performance. It's mostly walking around, leading kids into the woods. Maybe you see him stab them. It's mostly just walking around or sitting on a train or in the train station. It's not really until his confession does he really have to act or really have dialogue. But he does do a good job with it. And I will say, of the two, and I'm going to put a picture up, I do think that DeMunn looks more like Chikatilo pre-trial. Because a lot of the pictures you see, he'll be bald, which was common practice in Russia. They would shave killers on trial as protection against lice. So he actually had like wild curly gray hair and with his big Coke bottle glasses. So I do think Jeffrey DeMunn looks more like him pre-trial, whereas Malcolm McDowell in Evelenko, when he's bald, I think he looks and acts more like Chikatilo. But I do think Jeffrey DeMunn does do a fine job. Uh, Donald Sutherland, Stephen Rea, Max von Sydow all do great. Von Sydow was only in it for a couple scenes, but you definitely remember his scenes. And the accents don't bother me. The Russian accents all sound fine. Now, aside from that, um, Randy Edelman did the score, and the score did remind me of something. It's this very dramatic, sort of swollen type music. I can't remember. I thought of it while I was watching, but I can't remember exactly what it made me think of. And Robert Frace did the cinematography. First aired on HBO on February 25th, 1995. And it got really good notices. It was actually filmed. I, I thought it said something about being filmed at the actual train stations, but it was shot in Hungary. So before I get into the film itself, just as I always do, just some brief cliff notes on the killer himself. Uh, Andrei Chikatilo was or is the first major Russian serial killer. He was dubbed the Rostov Ripper or the Red Ripper, also the Butcher of Rostov. And I think there was a book somewhere called The Communist Who Ate Children. He murdered at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990 in Russian, Ukrainian, and Uzbekistani territories. He was arrested once in September of '84 as a suspect, excuse me, but due to forensic trouble and debauched bureaucracy, he was released to kill again. In April of '92, he confessed to 56 murders and was sentenced to death in 52 of the 53 that he was tried for. And he was executed by a single bullet on February 14th, 1994, at the age of 57. He was known as a sexual sadist and a necrosadist, which, being impotent, he could only reach arousal through a victim's pain, suffering, death, and mutilation, both before and after death. Hence the graphic and intense mutilation of their bodies, specifically in the genital region. His body count is believed to be surpassed by Russian serial killer Mikhail Popkov, with 78 confirmed kills and confessed to 81. And he was also apprehended in 2012. But Chikatilo's crimes were also running concurrently with another Ukrainian serial killer of Anatoly Onoprienko, who also had 52 victims. It was apprehended in 1996 and died in 2013. So now we get to the actual film, Citizen X, which, like I said, is more about the actual investigation rather than the life, crimes, trial, and death of the killer himself. So, in a way, it kind of is like Silence of the Lambs, where we follow the Clarice Starling of the film and get brief glimpses of the killer and his crimes. Though I'd say we get more Chikatilo in this than we do Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs. It opens up in 1982, which was the start of his continuous spree and manhunt. The film does ignore his prior kills, where he had a female victim in '78, which was his first, and then another victim in '81. But from '82 on was his continuous spree, and that was when the manhunt began. The first two were not linked to the manhunt. Stephen Rea, who plays Burakov, he was promoted to detective from forensic analyst. That was true. It shows 7 bodies being found badly mutilated and in various states of decomposition, which bodies weren't found for weeks to months. Many had 20 to 50 stab wounds, mutilated genitalia, and eyes missing. That's true, but between '82 and '83, only 7 victims. I can't even read my own notes. Though by 83, though he had 7 victims in 82. Oh, I think only 4 were actually found. Yeah, or 4 were linked to the same person. My notes are all over the place, so bear with me. And then all the stuff I said about the, you know, mutilation, states of decomposition, that was through voiceover because Burakov is still a forensic analyst at this point. He hasn't been promoted to a detective. I think this is just to show that there's already a serial killer at large and to just show us the kind of killer he is. Like 20 to 50 stab wounds, mutilated genitalia. It mentions that the eyes were taken out, which was something he did, because I think that's a Russian superstition. It shows that a serial killer, the idea of a serial killer being brushed off and impossible in Soviet Russia, saying, you know, it's not a Soviet issue. It's impossible to have a serial killer here in Soviet Russia. They even say that's a Western phenomenon, which they did believe of at the time. It shows Chikatilo with 2 kids, which is true, but they're shown to be young children, which his daughter was born in 65 and his son is 69, so they would have been young adults at that point. It does show a mentally challenged man confessing to the murders, which is true, because at first they thought, okay, it has to be pedophiles, homosexuals, or the mentally ill. And they did take a lot of mentally ill people from this specific school for the mentally challenged, and oftentimes would beat them into confessions. Now, the film does not go into a man who was actually arrested, tried, and executed for Chikatilo's crimes, which that did happen. This just shows that, you know, they're all over the place with it. So it does show one challenged man being pushed into a confession. Which it also doesn't mention that by doing that, they also stopped like over 1,000 sex crimes because they were only looking at pedophiles, homosexuals, whatever. Shows Chikatilo picking his victims at train stations, which was his main hunting ground. He liked it because kids were often by themselves. There was a huge homeless problem, so he wasn't the oddest person around. It shows Burakov being knocked down from lead investigator, which the only thing I found was they did bring in a supervisor in 1985, a guy named Kostoyev. There is a scene with Chikatilo and his wife attempting to have sex where she calls him pathetic for being impotent. From what I've read, they had already had 2 kids and she didn't really care if he was impotent. They just kind of married for convenience and procreation, which they already did. It's not like she hated him for it. Then we jump to the spring of 84, which it shows Chikatilo being arrested. He was arrested for trying to talk to several women. And he was found with knives, rope, and Vaseline. But in the movie, he's shown talking to a young man, and he had to be let go because, 1, he was a party member, and 2, because his blood type did not match the semen that was found. Now, this is true, and the end text also addresses this. Chikatilo's blood and semen were 2 different types, and now that's a very, very rare, like, I can't remember if it's million or billions, like 1 in a million or billion, but it was true. his semen and blood were two different types, and on that, and being a party member, he had to be let go. The end does say how it was never adequately explained, even though this one doctor did come out and say it is possible, but these are the chances, and people kind of laughed at it, but I think now it's more accepted as an idea or a possibility. Um, at that time, it says 36 bodies were found and linked to one killer, which at that time, going by the time he was arrested in September of '84, there were only 26 bodies that were linked to the killer. Which also, I didn't even get into the title. The title is what the investigation team was calling the killer. They were calling him Citizen X, and their little group, which I think was around 10 men, was called the Citizen X Task Force. Now, the only time Citizen X is brought up in the film is Dr. Bukanovsky's profile. That's what he calls him. It might be more or less the same in real life. I've always heard it as that's what Burakov and Fedishov, if I pronounce that correctly, that's what they were calling their unsub, for all you Criminal Minds fans. So we jump to the spring of '87, where they bring in the psychiatrist to profile the killer, much to the dismay and embarrassment of the Soviet Party, which was true. I couldn't find when exactly Bukanovsky was brought in, but he made a 40 to 60 page profile that was extremely spot on to Chikatilo, where the rough cliff notes was bad childhood, well educated, probably a teacher or businessman, though impotent and poor at making relationships with women. He's probably married and has children. His job would allow him to travel by train. So also since the victims were usually found on specific days of the week. And how his impotence leads him to using his knife as a substitute for his manhood. So, a very Freudian. And this was also the first time a psychiatrist had been consulted for a serial killer case in Soviet Russia. Now, when I did my cliff notes for Chikatilo, I didn't really go into his backstory, but if you look it up, I mean, it talks about, his brother possibly being cannibalized when the Nazis stormed Russia, having to eat dirt and leaves when they couldn't find food, eventually, his dad being a POW and then being mocked when he finally came home, chronic bedwetter but had to share a bed with his mother, and he was beaten and, scolded every time he went to bed. He had to wear glasses, but he wouldn't wear glasses because he thought that would get him more picked on, more than he already was. So there's a lot about his background that I didn't get into, but you look up anything on Chikatilo, he did have a rough childhood. So like I said in my monster review, anyone that said she was just a lost angel, a beautiful soul that just, wanted love, this guy had a rough childhood too, and he's a monster. So his profile was spot on. While they're going over the profile, it does show Chikatilo leading a young boy into the woods, and then in slow motion you see Jeffrey DeMunn. He's got like blood all over his mouth, which the most we see is him, on top of a victim, like stabbing him, or we get a stylish, like slow motion of a kid, like from the shoulders up, falling down in profile. No, it doesn't get graphic, which it doesn't need to because it's kids, but you get just enough through voiceover and the implications of what's on screen. Now, when you see with blood all over his mouth, is because he's believed to be a cannibal, and he was always known as a cannibal. He himself says he never really cannibalized, but he would bite off and nibble a bit because that would help him finish. um, so then we jump to the fall of 1990, which is when, fall of the Soviets. So now Burakov and I'm going to bring up that other guy's name just so I can properly pronounce it. Fedosov. So Burakov and Fedosov are now heads of the investigation, with Fedosov being general, Burakov being colonel, and now they can do what they want. So now they station a bunch of military men at every train station, a few undercover men at 3 smaller train stations. That was true. In, I think, October of 1990, they had 360 guys stationed at every train spot, with undercover ones at the 3 smaller train stations that had most of the murders. It doesn't really go into how Chikatilo followed the investigation so closely that he was always able to stay a step ahead. The film just kind of shows Chikatilo on the train noticing all the police, so just advancing to the next station. But there is a scene where they go to a smaller station and there is an undercover officer who says he saw a guy come out of the woods with dirt all over him. He didn't look like a regular forest scavenger. He was well dressed with dirt on his clothes, but he didn't search him. That was true. In real life, he noticed a possible blood smear on his face and a wound on his finger. But when they check all the interrogation slips, they notice Chikatilo's name, and he had been a suspect since '87. So then they do a search of that area. They find the body of a 22-year-old, which in the film she's addressed as Natasha Diankova. In real life, his final victim was Svetlana Korosty, but it was still a young woman at the train station when that officer saw him coming out of the woods. So then we jump to November 20th, 1990. It doesn't mention that he had been under surveillance for 6 days, but his arrest is pretty close to what really happened, which was, it showed him with a jar of beer, going to a park. He just left a kiosk, and then 4 undercover officers go in to arrest him. The only thing it didn't show was him attempting to talk to other children around the park, but other than that, pretty much the same. So then it says November 24th was the 5th day of interrogation. Then it says the 28th was the final day. And it said that it was their last day that they could legally hold him without a confession. In real life, they had 10 days, and this was the 8th day. And so that's when they decided to bring in Bukanovsky, which is true. But he did it on the 29th, and he just read his Citizen X profile. The film depicts it as reading it for 5 hours, and then Chikatilo breaks down crying. In real life, it was 2 hours. And then that's when he gave his full confession. And then it shows, the angry mob trying to get to Chikatilo after he was arrested. That's true. The applause for Abukhanov, that might have been dramatized. I haven't read anything about that. Now, when it shows Jeffrey Dahmer as Chikatilo in court, it shows him in his cage, which is regular practice in Russia. They always put the killer on trial in this cage, which normally it's a safety thing, but in Chikatilo's case, it was actually to keep him safe because the courtroom was just full of family members that just were out for blood. Now, And like I said, he had his head shaved, which was common practice. In the film, Jeffrey DeMunn still has his hair, but he's wearing a similar shirt. I don't know what you would call it, a weird patterned shirt. And he's kind of sitting in this weird. He's got similar like mad, like he's a guy gone mad, kind of mannerisms, which Chikatilo did. Some people don't know if he actually was insane or just acting for sympathy. At one point, he even dropped his pants and exposed himself, which the film does not show. But you can find a video of it. It shows how he led officers to other sites. I'm not 100% sure about that. But it says he was convicted of all 52 murders, 35 of which were under 17, which is true. He was tried for 53, but there was insufficient evidence for one of them, so he was convicted of 52. He confessed to 56, but they could only link him to those ones. And then it just ends with him being executed by a single bullet. Now, he was executed in an undisclosed location, but I don't think it was actually in the prison as the film shows. And supposedly his final words were, "Don't blow my brains out, the Japanese want to buy them." And I like how it's done. You just see the gun go right up to his head, then it cuts to black, bang, the end. So, yeah, very solid movie. Again, if you want to see more Chikatilo than investigation, I guess I would recommend Evelenko. But this one is more dramatized. It's more of like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, but I guess more factual than Henry, but more along the same lines of that. This is the most factual one that you're going to get. And again, like I've said for other films, like like Extremely Wicked or Hunt for BTK or whichever other one I've done. Oh, that Night Stalker one I did with Lou Diamond Phillips, where it's not necessarily about the killings itself, but when you see the actor in the portrayal, just with how much they look like them and their performance, it kind of makes you wish more of the film was dedicated to the killer's story specifically. Here, yeah, Jeffrey DeMunn does look enough like Chikatilo. He doesn't really get to do much as far as acting until his confession, but it is very faithful to the true story. Stephen Rea and Donald Sutherland are awesome in it. It's shot very, very well. It doesn't look like a TV movie. It doesn't even look like an HBO TV movie. It's HBO, so it can be a bit more graphic, but it's never boring. It's always able to keep your interest, and yeah, I would say as far as these detective procedural films going after a serial killer, whether it's based on a true story or not, this is one of the better ones that I've seen. Which in the 90s, that's what a lot of the thrillers were in a post Silence of the Lambs era. I wouldn't say it's as good as Silence of the Lambs. That's kind of the pinnacle of that kind of procedural story. But this one is very close. Again, but I wouldn't really put this in like the same grouping as Silence of the Lambs because this is a true story where that one isn't. But it's a very solid film. Just another example of how these made-for-TV serial killer movies, real-life serial killer movies, are among the best that you can find and the best representation of that story. So I will do Evelenko at some point. Probably going to be more I'm trying to think of the word differences than me saying true, because a lot of this is fabricated. Especially the idea of him having mind powers, which is weird. But yeah, Citizen X, very solid film. Definitely one of the better made-for-TV movie films I've seen, especially of this nature. Uh, Also, just a very good detective story as well, and a good story of how bureaucracy can get in the way, and pretty much what's known as one of the biggest blunders as far as how law enforcement screwed up an investigation. So, very solid film. I really enjoyed it. Definitely the most accurate account of the Chikatilo story and the investigation. But I do have a bunch more serial killer films to get to. We're about halfway through the month now. So I have plenty more, so stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.